Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time we talked about the Articles of Confederation, America's first form of government, and today we are talking about the Constitutional Convention, debates over ratification, and the Constitution itself. So, if you are ready, let's begin. So, the Constitutional Convention is essentially a meeting that happens with delegates from 12 different states. And they all go to Philadelphia in 1787 to basically discuss the issues with the Articles of Confederation and figure out how we should structure a new government. One state does not show up, and that is Rhode Island. They don't show up because they're afraid of being overpowered in this new meeting, which is ironic that then they didn't show up. But anyway, so they don't show up because they're afraid of being overpowered. So that's something to know. So again, like I said, they're debating the structure of the government, and they're going to kind of grow into two factions here: the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And we're going to kind of be breaking down these terms and these groups of people throughout this lesson and throughout our next couple of lessons. But just so we know that basically people break up into these two groups of people: the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And what are they? They're kind of trying to debate over the structure of the government. And so, one thing that they do decide is that they want a limited government, right? Just like they wanted with the Articles of Confederation and the Constitutional Convention, they want to figure out what limits there should be on the federal or the national government and what those limits should be. They want to work out some separation of powers and things like checks and balances so that one part of the government isn't too powerful over another, so we can avoid having a king. And we have this idea called federalism, right? And so federalism is where we divide the powers between the states and the central government. And again, this is because, as we saw with the Articles of Confederation, there's a large desire to avoid being like Great Britain, avoid having a monarch or a king. We just had a revolution to get over that. So we want to figure out, how do we avoid that? And that's where they're coming from with trying to create the separation of powers, the checks and balances, and the federalism. And then one little vocab thing for you to know is this idea called concurrent powers, which are things and ideas that both the states and the federal government can do, like create laws, but some of them have a little bit of more power than the others. But it's important to know these terms and kind of what they're debating at the Constitutional Convention. So, as they're debating, obviously not everyone's going to agree, and they're going to have to come up with some compromises. And this is the biggest thing that they break down. This is one of the most important compromises. So what they're trying to figure out is, in one of their branches, the legislative branch, which is the branch of government that's going to create the laws, debate the laws, vote on the laws. They want to figure out, well, who gets to be in the legislative branch? And there are two plans that get proposed. One of them is called the Virginia Plan. Now, Virginia is a big state. They have a lot of people. And they say, well, the amount of representatives that you have in the legislative branch should be based on the population of your state. More people, more representatives. Okay. New Jersey, a smaller state at the time, comes up with an idea that representation in the legislative branch should be equal per state. This is just like it was in the Articles of Confederation. So we have Virginia saying based on population, New Jersey saying it should be equal per state. How do we work through these ideas? We have something called the Great Compromise, or it's also known as the Connecticut Compromise, which combines the elements of the Virginia and the New Jersey plans into what we call a bicameral legislature, which you are familiar with today, pictured on the bottom left. We've got one part of the legislative branch that's going to be based on population. That's the House of Representatives. So that means the more people you have in your state, the more representatives you get in the House of Representatives. So, for example, California today has a lot more representatives than Connecticut, or back then, Virginia would have a lot more representatives than New Jersey. And the other part of the legislative branch is going to be equal representation. They're going to call this the Senate, and they're going to have two per state. And this is what we still have today. We have the House of Representatives based on population and the Senate, two per state. And for a law to get passed, it has to go through both parts of the legislative branch. So that's one of their major compromises, was how to figure out representation. Another idea that they need to figure out is slavery. So, we talked last time about how when they're creating America and these new forms of government, they have this idea of slavery and they're trying to figure out what should they do with it. And there's a lot of thoughts that, the ideas of the Enlightenment and the Declaration of Independence, we should, all men are created equal. Like maybe we should ban slavery, we should end it. But a lot of the states, especially in the South, are economically almost addicted to slavery and they don't want to get rid of it. And so they come up with a compromise, a couple of them. Okay, so one of them is called the Three-Fifths Compromise, because one of the issues is, well, if we're saying that the House of Representatives is based on your population of your state, where do slaves fit into this, right? Southern states would say, well, they should count as full people so that we have more representatives because they have more slaves, right? Northern states with less slaves, or states like Pennsylvania who have that gradual emancipation law, are saying, well, they shouldn't count at all. You're saying your slaves are your property. You're saying slaves are not people, so they should not count. And so the way that they compromise on this is they say that a slave is going to count as 3/5 of a person towards population. So 60% of your slaves would count for your population as far as the House of Representatives, which does favor the southern states a bit. And it's weird to even think about this. If we think about a slave as an African person, as a human being, to count them as 3/5 of a person for counting representatives, it does show both the North and the South how they're kind of viewing African slaves at the time. The other compromise that gets made is this idea called the slave trade compromise. Because, like I said, there are a minority, but a significant minority of people at the convention who want to get rid of slavery and they want to figure out how to end it. But most people are complicit with slavery or saying that they need to continue on. And so they're trying to figure out, well, how can we get rid of it slowly? And one way they're going to do that is with the slave trade compromise, which states that Congress could not ban the international slave trade until 1808, which they do end up banning the slave trade in 1808. So, what this says is that basically states are not allowed to import slaves from other countries after 1808. And so the hope of a lot of people at the time is that this is going to gradually phase out slavery because there won't be able to be importing any new slaves. But we will see in future lessons kind of how that turns out. And as we know, from U.S. history, it's not going to effectively end slavery. But this is one of their ideas for how to do it slowly. Okay, so we've talked about things that they're compromising about, and now we have to, as they try to ratify, which means to pass the Constitution, they've got to get votes from, I think, 2/3 of the states. But anyway, they got to get votes from these states to say that they want the Constitution to be passed and they want to get rid of the Articles of Confederation. And like I said, there's going to be two groups of people that are going to kind of form: the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now, at this time, the Federalists are going to be those that support the Constitution. They want it to get passed. And the Anti-Federalists are those who oppose ratifying or passing the Constitution. So Federalists are in favor of the Constitution, Anti-Federalists against it. Kind of makes sense with their names. Federalists in favor, anti against it. Okay. So what are the Federalists going to do to convince people to pass this Constitution? If you've ever watched Hamilton or seen the play or listened to the music, there's a great song about this next idea. And so what happens is that a few of the people at the Constitutional Convention write these documents called the Federalist Papers. Alexander Hamilton is one of these guys who writes these papers. And they're basically a series of 85 different essays that are written to defend the Constitution and basically encourage states to vote to ratify or to pass the Constitution. And now, if you were an AP Gov, you would need to know a lot of these Federalist Papers. But for our class, a couple of them are important. So Federalist Paper number 10 talks about the idea of factions and controlling different groups of factions within the Constitution and how the Constitution will help that. And Federalist number 51 is all about how great it is that there's a separation of powers between the branches of government and that there's checks and balances. Okay, so we got to figure out Eventually, we know the Constitution gets passed. Why does this happen? Why do the Anti Federalists agree? And the main reason they agree is that the Federalists promise to add a very important amendment to it, or group of amendments called the Bill of Rights. So, the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Now, an amendment is just a fancy word for change. So these are the first 10 changes. And the idea is that these are supposed to protect individual rights in the Constitution, things that the Constitution did not spell out. They are supposed to restrict the power of the national government, preserve people's liberties, preserve people's freedoms. Like if you think about the first bill, the first amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, these are things that aren't in the Constitution, but the Anti-Federalists felt that they were so important that they needed to get in there right away. So like I said, the Federalist promise will pass this immediately. Many people wanted the Bill of Rights in. Some people wanted it as a part of the Constitution in its entirety. Some people thought, we just got to pass the Constitution. We need to get rid of the Articles of Confederation. We'll put it in afterwards. But most people did think it needed to be included because they wanted to focus on ensuring that people had their rights. So the Bill of Rights is very important to know about and how they kind of come to that idea. So another thing we've been talking about, and this is our last main slide for the notes today, is this idea of checks and balances. And this is how the government's going to work with each other to make sure that one branch is not too powerful than the other. And one thing we do want to know is that the Constitution is going to create a much stronger central government. The failure of the Articles of Confederation inspires this. The Articles of Confederation were weak. The national government did not have enough power. States had a lot of power. And so we saw, because of things like Shays' Rebellion, that we needed to create a way for a stronger central government to provide support and to have control. So most people agree, we need to have a stronger central government. And so in order to create a strong central government that doesn't have too much power like a king, they come up with the idea of branches and separate powers for each branch, like the executive, legislative, and the judicial branch, and that each branch should be able to check the other branch. Like the legislative branch can pass a law, but the president can veto it if he doesn't like the law. But the legislative branch can come back to that law, and if 2/3 of the states say yes, they can still make the law happen. Now, the judicial branch, if they think the law is unfair, they can vote that the law is unconstitutional in a Supreme Court decision, right? So each branch, that's just one example, but each branch has a way to check the other branch. That one branch supposedly cannot get too powerful. Important that we know our three branches. Executive branch, that's the president. Legislative branch, that's the branch that creates the laws. Judicial branch, that's our Supreme Court justices. Okay, and remember that we have a bicameral legislature, meaning we have two houses, one based on population, one based on equality for every state. So in America's government, the national government, Washington, D.C. today, right, shares its powers with the state. But it's important to note that the national government reigns supreme in most conflicts. So if there's a little debate over, well, there's two laws, that there's one of the state and one of the national government, what law reigns supreme? Who has more power? The national government is going to have more power. Okay. That's the Constitution. That's the Constitutional Convention, the debates over the ratification, and how they get to create the Constitution. As always, it's important to know these big ideas. So let's take a look. This is a way for you to summarize the notes. Number one, what is the biggest difference between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution? Number two, how are the powers divided in the Constitution? And number three, what was the Anti-Federalist biggest issue with the Constitution, and how is it solved? Make sure you answer those. And hopefully this was a good lesson for you. Hopefully you understand the Constitution a little bit better. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.